and welcome to the next edition of the Hack the Planet podcast, the only podcast that has been continuously burned out since August of 2003. We are joined today by a special guest, Lay, the founder of the Disconnect Camp, which is an infosec camp where people don't use computers, which is kind of an interesting concept. So say hello.
Howdy.
We're also joined by our usual panel. So we have Dan.
How's it going?
Hey. We got Mitchell.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Hey, Happy New Year. Justin.
Hey guys, it's good to see y'all again.
And Virus.
Hello.
Hey. So just to get started, I'm really interested in the concept of Disconnect Camp, and we'll definitely be getting into that and the sort of the influences and broader topic a little bit later. So I'm wondering, I know you have a pretty interesting backstory, and so I'm wondering how you got involved in infosec in the first place.
Yeah, well, infosec really started my love of computers, as I think everybody typically ends up saying. You know, I got a computer at a young age. I had to choose between a car and a computer, and I chose a computer, and I got stuck at home with it between the ages of like 16 to 18. And, you know, I installed Linux and just started hacking away whatever I could. I had, a friendly scare and care visit from the FBI agents when I turned 18, and I would like to say, got my act in order after that. And I had some fun working, technical jobs, going to college a little bit, and ended up working at a place that saw I knew what I was doing with security stuff, and slowly but surely, turned that into a real career, or at least, what I like to think is a career. And I got interested in I should say also shout out to all the really old school meetups. Security meetups is really where I probably got my chops, or my skills honed, starting with the 2600 groups and the underground groups. That's pretty much kind of my backstory is back before it was so easy to learn how to hack. I had to meet people in meet space, and then we'd share trade, how to do this, how to do that, where were you learning stuff, do little conferences, not really conferences, sorry, the little talks at events, and, meet people with new skills and share your skills. So that's kind of my backstory.
Where was your home? Where was your first 2600 meeting? What city?
Yeah, that was Orange County 2600, the original OC 2600. So that was the one that I think the first month it ran, we were a bunch of under 18-year-olds, right? Statute of limitations now in place. It's been 20 years. And I think half the people that went to the first meeting got arrested before the next meeting. And then we basically were in this weird limbo for the next 6 months or so of everybody creepily doing side channel communications of is it safe to meet up, or who's still being watched. What lists have we all gotten ourselves on by going to one meeting?
Oh wow! Did they get arrested as a result of being at the meeting, or was it a coincidence?
It was activity related to the meeting, and then you start talking about concerns of conspiracy, about who talked to whom about what, and that's what happened. Again, kind of when I turned 18, which was a few years later, the feds, this is in the 90s, right? The feds or the cops who handled the cases were more about, at least at that time, they were more about scare and care, knock it off, kid. They weren't trying to get an arrest in or make a big name for themselves. They're knock it off, and you can have a good job in a few years.
Yeah. So was that the 95 Secret Service freak out?
This is late 90s. I got entrapped in not really entrapped, but caught up by Patriot Act. So this is late 90s, early 2000s. So Patriot Act, well, I knew it was 100% a legitimate thing that I was being spied on based on the Patriot Act because it was connections I had. And then, a nice FBI agent comes to the house, tries to talk to me about, hey, what have you been doing, son? Have you been hacking things? Tell me what you know about this fraud. Yeah.
So when in there when did you go to your first Defcon?
Yeah, that was, all around those same years, 2000, I want to say. 2000 or 2001. It was whichever one Defcon 9 was at Alexis Park.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, I like to call the Alexis Park Defcon years the halcyon years, at least for me. And
Yes.
everybody's got their years, their favorite years of Defcon, and those were mine. So that can easily put me into like a bin, so you can kind of understand my version of Defcon.
I think everyone who went to the Alexis Park years, those are their favorite years for the most part. Because for those of you that don't remember the Alexis Park, DEFCON didn't used to be at a casino. It used to be at a hotel in Vegas, and the event would take over the entire hotel, which created this kind of alternate reality where, there were just every other room in this hotel. This is a 2-story hotel that totally surrounded this. There was like a pool all through the middle of it, and then this was like this 2-story building going around this pool. And basically there was a room party in like every other room, just constantly for days on end. And the hotel staff, I think there wasn't very much of a hotel staff. As I recall, there was like one guy who was always angry, and he was perpetually fixing the vending machines, right? So he wasn't like talking to anybody or making eye contact, but he was always trying to fix the vending machines because someone had always done something to them, and he was like swearing to himself constantly. And that was like the only. Yeah, I don't remember seeing much security, to be honest, because I do remember seeing a lot of stuff where if there had been security, you would think the security would probably have gotten involved.
Oh, that was a famous security guy who getting his shirt stolen, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, that guy in the yellow security shirt getting a lap dance by the pool, that was security. He just joined. He assimilated to the DEFCON crowd. And that's what I remember of those years was I think there would be the random person that got a room at the Alexis Park and they didn't know it was DEFCON thing was. But by the end of the weekend, like they're assimilated in the group, right? It was a lot of like love and like whatever, like we don't care, like you can come join our group. We got booze, we got all this stuff. And we would leave I'm sure the staff afterwards had a Bonza party because they would have just boxes and boxes of booze left for them. And they tended to seem to enjoy it.
Everyone would fly home and leave the booze. Like, yeah, totally.
Much different once the Riviera years started.
Did you start hanging out with like the folks at the shop like after, like did gooning lead to the shop or did the shop lead to gooning?
When did you start gooning? We skipped a step.
So I started gooning. I was hanging out with the people from the shop. 23B is the group. 23 and 23B should kind of make it as this big collective group. I hung out with them because they were my local like people, and I kind of knew them here and there. We'd hang out at other meetups, kind of like what you guys used to do. And before the coronavirus, like have our monthly meetup. And I knew them through that, and that's what led to me starting gooning. And I think the shop, the 23B shop, opened after I'd started gooning. So it was a timeline thing, less than a group that I joined first. 23B shop just didn't exist yet. And the 23B shop is like, it's its own incantation now.
So when did you start gooning?
Yeah, what year is Riviera's first year? I want to say like 14.
Yeah,
15?
14, I think.
Something like that. So I have that traditional DEFCON memory of like I can't remember which year is which. Like it's like where we were in specific years. I'm not sure. It's this long collective combined memory in my head.
I only remember 14 was the Riv because 13 was the last year at the AP.
Yeah, 13 was the last one at the AP, and then there was the Riv after that.
Yeah.
And the vibe kind of changed a lot because now it's in a casino. And so the Riv had that whole back building where the skyboxes were and all that, where it wasn't really the casino and it was kind of its own little world back there. But still, you had to go through the casino floor to get to the rooms. And that meant that there was casino security and they were a lot more. A lot of them were old guys that I remember people kind of getting to run around in a funny way. But it was it started to be a little bit more of the outside world was kind of intruding in the event a little bit more.
Yeah. It definitely changed the venue. Like, I remember the first year I gooned was at the Riviera. And in my mind, I still remembered the Alexis Park days where you could just wander around and find a party. You could always like find a party. Every room was a hacker most likely. And if not, you could like quickly assimilate and make friends. But yeah, at the Riviera, I remember going up and down elevators, like looking for parties. I'm like, I'm bored. I need something to do. It's like 3 a.m. I don't want to sleep yet. And like just wandering around, I couldn't find any. They turned into room parties, and they kind of adjusted that later, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I have some similar memories. Although I eventually did adapt some coping strategies where I'd sort of lock into a large collection of booze, go down by the pool, see if anyone was by the pool, and then go up to the top of all of the towers and listen for sound, and then try and trade booze to get in the room. Right, and that ended up working for most of the Riv years, but so what? Well, how did you decide to start gooning as opposed to just drinking heavily?
Well, yeah, I got invited by another goon to say, a senior goon. He was like, "Hey, you should join. Like, you seem to have a level head on yourself, and like, you're not going to wig out and break people or break yourself during the event." So, yeah, I joined. Yeah, and it was mostly because the year of the Riviera, they knew it was a bigger space, so they just anybody who knew somebody was like, "Come on, join." So yeah, I got a recommendation and joined up that year, and I think I worked for about seven or so years, continuous.
Oh yeah, all through the Riv and
yeah, all through the Riv, all through the Rio, and I was really glad. I think I saw that I went other years, right, and I saw Caesars, the whole collective they have in multiple hotels, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger every year. Like the walking distances are just getting astronomical now.
Well, Caesars Defcon was such a trip for me because that's where Black Hat used to be, So it was like Defcon is Black Hat now. Then what's Black Hat? It was just like really confusing internally.
Yeah, Galleria Bar is dead. Long live Galleria Bar.
yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
No, really, like Black Hat's RSA.
Yeah, but just that whole shift was really trippy. Because it's also like it kind of drives home how short-lived Vegas casinos are. Like they get all used up, from brand shiny new and expensive and classy to like all used up and about to be demolished inside of like 20 years, probably. Right?
Pretty much.
I think the reason they moved to the Riv in the first place was because it was a few years away from being demolished, and they just didn't give a fuck anymore. And a lot of people stayed at the Stardust across the street, which isn't there anymore either. So it was basically like, DEF CON just kind of used it up right before they were tearing it down.
So the lesson here is that our hacker conferences have a longer half-life than the average Las Vegas casino or hotel.
That's definitely true so far. But there's also, there's a famous story about Nauticon, which was the hacker conference in Cleveland. Where Froggy, the guy that ran Nauticon, when he was booking, he was talking to the hotel managers to get a hotel to have the event in, and they were grilling him, like asking him what kind of organization this was, what kind of event this was, because eventually he found out that the last time they had booked an event without asking any follow-up questions, it had turned out to be FurryCon. And they had no idea that was even a thing. So they were just trying to sniff around him to figure out if this was going to be like a fursuit event. But they didn't want to come out and say it, right? And eventually they had the party there. We totally kind of, partied very hard and vaguely wrecked the place, but the hotel people just loved us. So that led to a lot of jokes about, I guess at least we're not all furries, or at least at this event.
I've worked a few furry cons in my day.
Well, it's all well and good, but you can imagine if you're a Midwestern hotel manager and you've never heard of that as a thing, that would be a little bit traumatic.
Well, also, the furry cons that happen on the East Coast are way crazier than the furry cons that happen in the Midwest or on the West Coast. There's a different level of crazy out there, man.
Oh, well, I'll have to take your word for it. But,
so speaking of crazy, I imagine 7 years of being a goon. you probably, I don't know if you had crazy job responsibilities or situations that you had to get into, but sort of like for some of the folks who may not be familiar with Defcon and what the goon experience is like, how was that for you?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I entered the goon experience coming in hot from the Alexis Park years, and my mentality was, I'm kind of here to protect the people from themselves, like the attendees from themselves, and also protect the attendees from consequences and responsibility of the real world. So, like at the Alexis Park, there would be like one year somebody started selling lockpicks, and by the end of the event, like the end of the weekend, like every lock in the entire like facility is unlocked because hackers, and new toys will mean they start attacking stuff. And, they'll use their toys and the abilities the best they can. So a lot of it is, some crazy stuff you deal with, and it's keeping hackers protected from themselves. Turns out you can't play with the gaming machines at all, no matter how funny you think hitting like Alt F4 or Control Alt Delete is. That might work, and they don't care. They're just going to haul you away to jail. So it was me trying to make sure people knew not to do that sort of shit. And, protecting themselves. I helped an old friend from forever ago as he stumbled literally on top of the hotel security. Like one of the senior staff of the actual hotel security, the guy who calls 911 and gets you dragged out, and like 86 from the property. This is a 6.5 foot tall, 250-pound guy, just fell on him. And I just lifted him up, and I didn't know who he was. And I started dragging him away, and he's going to get belligerent at me. Guy's way bigger than I am, and he's getting belligerent. He's like, Lay? I'm like, Bagel, let's go. And we just go off and socialize. We went from like basically a little altercation, like face, like drunk fight to, hey, let's have parties. Let's go drink some more. And that's pretty much the responsibility in my mind, in my worldview, of kind of what the goon is there for, is to protect the attendees from harming themselves, or, the real world from harming the attendees.
Yeah, it's always a very tenuous and sort of, especially if you're new, relationship between the goons and the attendees of the event. And I don't know, I've heard a little bit about how that's changed, and there's been some movements inside of the goon squad to sort of like try and make the faces and sort of like team more accessible and friendly to folks, and it seems like that's going really well over the past few years.
Yeah,
it reminds me there's similar things at the Rainbow Gathering. It's almost like a microcosm of social libertarianism and the community taking care of things instead of an authority.
I mean, I have a different kind of DEFCON goon story also. So the first talk I gave at DEFCON was at DEFCON 13. And my little like group of friends had a sort of tradition that whenever any one of us was giving a conference talk, everyone else would show up, sit in the front row with a bottle of tequila, and basically like encourage whoever was giving the talk to take shots at like random and inappropriate times, right? And so they were sitting up front with and they poured me literally. They knew I hated Cuervo, and they poured me like a full plastic cup, like a Dixie cup full of Cuervo. And before the talk started, I'm sitting there like looking at this Cuervo, and I was like, oh man, I'm going to make this into a drinking game, right? I'm like, anytime I say, I'm going to take a drink. Anytime I don't look up from my notes for 30 seconds, like take a drink, And I think Priest was head of security that year, and apparently he was watching that on the video feed and thought it was hilarious. So about 15 minutes, 20 minutes into my talk, he like knocks the door open from the back, storms down the aisles, and like led everybody in the hall in this like drinking song, like, here's to Brother Ben, Brother Ben, Brother Ben, here's to Brother Ben, the best of us all. And that one ends with drink, motherfucker, drink, motherfucker, drink, motherfucker, drink, at which point you're supposed to chug your beverage, right? And I still had this like glass of Cuervo. So I actually had PTSD for a number of years after this. Not like bad PTSD, but I got like full-on flashbacks of 700 people chanting, drink, motherfucker, drink, motherfucker, drink, motherfucker, drink. And then I did, in fact, down this Cuervo and like got through the rest of the talk while like tequila sweating pretty hard.
Was this the one that you did in Lisp?
No. This was before that. But so that and it kind of blows my mind that was like the security for the event, but there's definitely an element of like it's more fun, I think, than a usual security team in a lot of ways. Or they're really sort of, part of the fun of the event. But I do feel like that might have gotten a little darker as the casino years went by. So how did over the 7 years you were a goon, kind of how did that age?
Yeah, I mean, it aged, definitely for me. It didn't age well, particularly well. I ended up being the more, basically, like you mentioned, the more casino it got and the more corporate it got, the more it seemed like I'm a volunteer, and I wasn't even, like, I'm not paid to be there. I'm there on my own money. I travel there on either my work's time or out of my own pocket. And at the end of the day, it stopped being fun. And like, to me, I wasn't helping enough people. I felt like, people kind of calmed down a lot. The attendees weren't having so many alcohol poisonings, you could say. So it's like, yeah, and with it spread out and not as many dense parties, I think the last year that I was like really like, oh wow, like I'm really useful was when they had like the bar hopping. And the bar hopping was just a bunch of rooms of like no lighting. I have no idea what's going on. Like we'd find people passed out on couches. And it's just like, oh great, like let's take the now passed out people, make sure they're breathing, do a basic medical like assessment and make sure they can survive and be on their way. But yeah, that was the last bit of like, I'm really here to help people. And it started becoming more, I'm here to like check badges and like, and which I never checked badges very well, for the record. I always made a game out of it. If you said you belonged at the event, and I'm like, okay, so prove it. And I'd like ask, 3 questions, like a quick game of like, 30 questions. And if somebody said they were a social engineer, I'd tell them they already failed. Because most of the questions would be like, they'd all be technical questions. Like, do you know programming languages or network protocols? And then they're like, oh, I'm a social engineer. I'm like, then you already failed. Like, should have been past me somehow. So.
Nice.
Yeah, I definitely noticed like relationship shift point. Like just with authority at the event. Because like it used, I remember, the first time I was at Defcon, I was a 17-year-old kid. And there was this kind of buffer zone where like you do some shenanigans and it was a very social process of being told like you done fucked up. You know what I mean? And like, I remember feeling very safe because like if I did something that was like shenaniganry but wasn't that bad, I would get like a don't do that again from like, Pappy or Flea or somebody, and it was okay. Like, you were given the opportunity to respectfully acknowledge that like, yes, I did some shenanigans and I'm now being told to stop doing shenanigans, so I will go the other way now, Dad. And then versus like the Riv experience. I guess I'm thinking like I remember the first year at the Riv, where me and the rest of the guys I hang out with had borrowed the mobile club, which I know you know about. Like,
I know.
And somehow like the message didn't get out that like we had permission to borrow it. So I'm like dancing around with this big cart full of speakers going up on skyboxes. And at one point in the middle of the night, we like turn around and Pappy's standing behind me. I think it was like Pappy and you and one other person. And they're like, hey, what are you doing with the club? I'm like, oh, I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so. And, and kind of looks at me like, okay, but no, really, like, why do you have the club? I'm like, no, really, like, I legitimately talked to so-and-so. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. We just wanted to make sure. And he turns around himself and goes, okay, boys, it's all right. And I kind of, look down the line and lo and behold, there's like 20 red shirts like, ready to like forcibly reclaim this thing. I'm like, oh, we almost got the shit kicked out of his eye. Oh, okay, all right, log, right? Yeah. But it was cool. Like, I used to be able to have that relationship with the goons. I remember when you had started. And that was kind of how we were hanging out. And then I remember like the following year, like literally getting off of an elevator on the wrong floor, which was like poorly marked. And it was like literally 2 hours of law enforcement interview. And like, if you don't give answers that way, like you are going to jail. It was just like this very, very different, like authoritarian regime.
Yeah, I liked when you mentioned the Rainbow Gathering earlier. Like, it definitely changed from more of a libertarian like openness with the goons to way more of an authoritarian. Like, my job stopped being protect the people from themselves, and it started being like protect the event from the people. Right? Make sure they've got their badges. Make sure the lines are going smoothly. Right? Make sure people are cooperating. We get special memos about special attendees that needed to be properly like watched or characterized, because there's always like memos like, oh, there's this dangerous guy coming, he might start some shit with so and so, and like, yeah, we get like, so we ended up becoming like like loss prevention more than there for the people in the community.
Yeah, and it sounds almost like there's a secret police vibe going on. And then somewhere in there, you mentioned the increased corporatization or whatever. Somewhere in there in the Riv years, I remember they kind of let the NSA show up with coloring books or whatever, but they started getting like cozy with the NSA. Yeah, and you thought the first time I heard that, I was like, oh, that's a joke, right? They got NSA coloring books, but no, the NSA legit made coloring books like aimed at kids that were not a joke. It was like, and they were handing them out in in one of the Defcon rooms, and it was kind of like, what is happening here? Like, it's just very weird.
That's surreal. Huh.
Well, I think part of that might have been tied to like they wanted to get keynote speakers at Black Hat or something that were like related to the NSA, and I don't know. I think they were just making some people were making friends further up in the government at that point.
Quid pro quo, but not the illegal kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna. I don't really hold it against anyone like trying to make a buck. And the thing is like they couldn't get the Alexis Park as a venue anymore, so they had to get some venue, right? And the original reason they chose Las Vegas is because it was cheap for everyone to fly there, because the flights are subsidized, and they wanted people to come from all over the country. And at that point, the only venues that were available in Vegas were a lot more expensive, And so it's not necessarily anyone's fault exactly. It's just like everything got bigger, and that meant the budget got bigger, and that meant they needed more money, and everything needed to get bigger.
And the money has interests.
Yeah, exactly. But also, it is just sort of the loss of of it being like an autonomous zone, so to speak. To coin a phrase I'm not supposed to be using, but or to use a phrase anyway. But it stopped being so much of a like another world, right? And it started just being like an event that was happening in a hotel casino.
This makes me want to stick to tour camps.
Yeah. Tour camp is still so. Tour camp is the local hacker camp out here. It's based on the German CCC camp. And both of those events, CCC camp's like 3,000 people, tour camp's like 500-600 at this point. And there are other camps too. There's EMF in England. There are hacker camps.
Dutch camp.
There's the Dutch camp alternating with CCC camp. But there are hacker camps all over the world of various sizes that do, by virtue of being set up in a relatively remote location, not in a hotel, but like out in a field somewhere, they do manage to recapture that kind of, it's a separate, space, for a time. And it does, and everybody is, it's more of a community vibe. Like everybody's you can just wander from campsite to campsite, and people from all over the place will be like, this is the booze I brought from my homeland, right? And you can, and if you do wander by the Scottish camp, do not drink the Buckfast, basically, is all I have to say. That'll end badly.
Very communal, non-authoritarian feel there. Such a pleasant experience,
Yeah, right up until you down a bottle of Buckfast, and then all bets are off, man. They say that's the cause of all violence in Scotland, and I believe them. Anyway, it's made by monks though, so they can't ban it. It's like Four Loko. It's like fortified wine with caffeine added, but it's made by monks, right? So it's like it's safe. Oh boy, tangent. Anyway, so this kind of leads into our main thread. So after 7-8 years of gooning, you ended up getting into disconnect camp, at least eventually. So how did that get going?
Yeah, so it's all kind of like tied in. Disconnect camp, I knew the venue for disconnect camp like 5 years before I first ran the disconnect camp. It was like a venue where we like had kind of family gathering type things, and I had run a camp there initially for the Defcon goons, right? The security goons and like the goons that like were kind of local to California area. And I was like, hey, come on down. Let's hang out at this venue. It's this awesome like campsite. It's basically like a kid's summer camp, but the owner is still fairly kind of like hippie-esque, right? He's kind of like a deadhead, but who's gone all nice and corporate now. He's super chill guy. And he kind of let us come in for events and just hang out. And we got the whole space. And it's of like, I think I want to say like 10 or so cabins, like little single bunk or like 4 or 5 bunk cabins. So people could like rent out their private little cabins, and they've got this massive lodge where the staff cooks for you. So it ends up being like you have no responsibilities while you're there. And I was doing this for like the DEFCON goons that would come out. And it turns out not a lot of them like came out for shit like outside of DEFCON. Like they didn't really like socializing so much because there's a lot of strife, which kind of gets into why I left gooning. But since I knew this venue and I had done a camp for goons, and some of these people were kind of salty when non-goons would show up to the camp, I said, fuck it, like it's my own camp. So I just started calling it Disconnect Camp, and I invited anybody I knew. And I said, you guys, come out, like hang out. It's this great venue. You don't have responsibility for the weekend or however long the event is. Like all the food's taken care of. You've got lodging. You just hang out and like relax with like-minded people. And again, that protection vibe was really a lot what I was going for. And also the secondary intention, which is like self-responsibility, right? So somebody would come with a tent. And they're like, how do I set up a tent? I'm like, you're going to figure that out real quick, aren't you? And like, I'll be there in 15 minutes, in case you can't. But I'm going to give you 15 minutes to fail. And most of the time, people love that stuff. They love taking care of shit on their own and figuring out that sort of thing. And that's kind of like the vibe that I was trying to bring back with that. I had dealt with some issues, personal issues, you could say, related to my break from DEFCON. And what I like to kind of explain as like my worldview, the things that I felt were true were definitely not true. And my behavior, because of how I felt those things were true, was not jiving well with the greater group. And it turns out I bounced out of not only DEFCON, not only like California community that I was part of, but I bounced out of the whole United States. I said, fuck it, I'm gone. And I left for about 1 to 2 years. I went to Asia. I did that thing, the standard, like, I'm going to go find myself. But there's this greater story there. And I basically found a whole new way to like look at the world. Basically found out that, what the worldview I thought was that existed didn't, that was only in my mind. And I dealt with a lot of like, again, there's a lot of issues and difficulties, mental and psychological things to deal with through all that. When I came back to the States, I basically just delved into because it's because I'm autodidactic. I found out I can't like go to a therapist and have them tell me what to do. It turns out I have to like sit down and read all the fucking books to figure out what the fuck I need to do. And therapists are great and they're very useful for people, but certain types like me, like it was helpful, but it wasn't getting me closer to the goal that I needed to get to, which is figure out what the fuck I did wrong, figure out why it was wrong, and figure out how I can avoid that in the future. Me like absorbing myself in a bunch of psychology and philosophy, I ended up becoming the last disconnect camp, which was primarily focused on, I don't want to say mental health because that was like the subtext of it all. Like, it's like, come out and disconnect. Like, it's really, and I was just telling my friends, like, no, seriously, just come out. It's cool. It's like a vacation. And then when they got out there, they would, all the speakers that I got were like basically mental health field related. Some people were from the community, had similar stories to me. Like they, had some tragic event happen. They had a breakdown and like were rebuilding themselves. And there's stories about how rebuilding yourself stories are just great, in my opinion. Some of the stories came out from that were great. I like the story about how I got a psychologist, like an actual medical psychologist giving talks, was because he submitted a talk for the first disconnect camp as a social engineering talk. And I was like, I don't know who this guy is. He says he's a doctor. Like, and like social engineers, they're not my favorite, right? As I kind of mentioned earlier, like they're not like my favorite field of hacking exploration. But I'm like, I'm going to give this guy enough rope to hang himself with. So go ahead, come on, Mr. Doctor of Psychology, come on, sure, come here and like give us your talk. And he gave a great talk because he went into the details about like how and why social engineering works. Like he explained like the default mode network where people kind of like want the least abrasive answers to things. Most people are complacent when they're set in that mode. And it was great to hearing that. So yeah.
Oh, I've heard that described as the cognitive miser theory, right? Like people have a tendency to be cognitive misers. They want to do as little thinking as possible in almost any situation. So they tend to they reach for things they already know or already believe, even in the face of other evidence, right? They're willing to overlook things. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly. Go for it.
Oh no, I was just going to say that one of the best things about Disconnect Camp, I thought, was the way that it's the only other event I've been to, among other things, where it captured the concept of storytelling and just the mental space of being able to tell a story in a relaxed environment. At Tour Camp kind of had that the second year, where they invited, it was held on native land, and they had convinced I say the word convinced, it was done very subjectively, ethically, and like, good intentions were put into the negotiations. But they had a tribal elder of the people who own the land actually run a quote unquote track, and were kind enough to honor attendees by telling stories in the traditional fashion, the way that stories are passed down, in their culture, and not having to be a literal part of that culture and getting to you literally got to sit around a campfire and hear stories, and it had a very therapeutic effect. And I remember thinking that I had never experienced anything close to that other than sitting in the cabin at Disconnect Camp. And one of the greatest experiences was it was supposed to be like 30 minutes where we were just going to tell non-repeating stories. Just a nothing you say will be repeated beyond this room, kind of relax and say what you want to say. And I mean, yeah, there were some funny jokes, and there was some commiseration, but there was some real, just like people who needed to get stuff off their chest, people who'd seen stuff on contracts that really bothered them. And it was like it became very intensely like AA very quickly.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that appeals to me so much about the kind of Disconnect Camp idea, right? Like the other hacker camps there are still very tech focused. Everybody's on their laptop most of the time. Everybody's still connected to the network. They're still talking about work stuff. Some of them are even doing work remotely, like from the event. That's really common at CCC camp. But I don't think anyone is laughing at the idea of having a psychologist show up at an infosec event at this point. Because like for me, I've burned out hard several times. I've seen stuff on engagements I've had a real hard time coping with. And I've experienced this sort of like anguish of really feeling like you have no impact on the world. Like you can see all these problems, you even know how to fix them, and like no one will listen to you, right? And people just keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and it seems like you can't really make an impact on it, and that kind of frustration is like, in the 80s they used to call it going postal. Where the post office had recruited all these Vietnam vets to be letter carriers, and something about the fact that the mail never stopped coming would really sort of trigger these horrible mental problems, and they'd end up like shooting up a post office. Well, like that kind of stopped, right? And people now think going postal is just a Terry Pratchett novel, or they don't remember what the origin of the phrase was. I personally have experienced infosec burnout. I've seen everyone I know experience it in some way, shape, or form, including everyone on this call. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
spent a non-zero amount of time crying in Ben's basement.
When you
Yeah.
talk about rebuilding yourself, it's sort of like I'll go through periods where it's like, oh, I got to go through a rebuilding cycle, and you go through the steps of like diet, sleep, just the basics, and trying work your way up through it, and
Brick
and
by
also
brick.
just trying to come up with some concept of like purpose, like what is it I'm doing with my life, And,
Right,
like,
because
you have-
it's a redefinition of that, right? Like
Yeah.
what you previously had internalized as your purpose, right? If you continue to run into hurdles or a lack of traction on that, you have to change that definition. And that since
Yeah.
that's foundational to everything else you're doing, that requires such a significant amount of energy investment to actually do.
I think the going postal analogy is actually really aptly good. Because I mean, if you take a step back and at scale, look at a lot of the burnout stories. Like a lot of it is like our quote unquote field. If we were to narrow it down to profession and not hobby, even though really the lines are very blurry, right? Like our quote unquote job is to effectively solve an unsolvable problem, right? Like computers don't understand meaning. Security is relative. So effectively our job is impossible at every level, at all the different subcategories and different subgroups, right? So making iterative progress on this is not really an attainable thing. But because capitalism, the entire human race decided to build the rest of society on top of the internet before it was finished, so to speak. And so this is where we are. And so, I mean, to use the going postal analogy, right? Like the mail just keeps coming, which is why people go postal, right? They can't fundamentally change their environment. And effectively, our entire social sphere is one where you can be very good at your job, you can be very terrible at your job, but at the end of the day, the likelihood that you'll be able to affect the field that you're in at scale is like provably impossible. Like you can't, like you're not going to go to work today and make a little bit of progress on making entropy less of a thing. Right? You're not gonna solve the branch explosion problem in constraint solving a little bit at a time. Like you're not gonna figure out how to count prime numbers a little bit at a time. Like these are like truly huge academic problems, and unfortunately, until very recently, and even now, like we don't really have a way to make a comfortable living wage working on those problems. So instead, we kind of bullshit. We well, I'll solve it at the implementation layer, even though that's not really a thing. And like, at least I'll buy myself time. Like that's like basically every job is like buying yourself time to actually solve the problem, right? Or at least to take a crack at the problem, because that's really all you want to do is sit in a corner and take a crack at this really hard problem.
Well, and I think you raise another kind of important point there too, which is that for a lot of us, this started out as a somewhere between a hobby and an obsession, but it's something like a personal passion we were all probably doing before someone started paying us to do it, right? So like there's an aspect of like this is maybe for a lot of the people in the infosec field, this is more like who we are than it is a job, and I think that makes that raises the stakes on everything a lot, to the point where it's like an existential problem, and I don't mean in the sense of like some old French writer. I mean like in the sense of like this is what our existence is about.
We're not 9-to-5ers.
Yeah,
not 9-to-5ers. Yeah, once we're off work, we're still doing computer stuff.
We're still
nonstop.
obsessing about how we how to fix this problem we can't really ever fix, right?
And like
disconnect. It sounds really cool. I mean, it sounds like it's a place where people can go and get a therapeutic release from like their PTSD.
The workplace. Yeah, the workplace PTSD.
I think we're very much sold on the concept. Is the summary of the last few minutes here?
Yeah.
It sounds wonderful. Yeah.
One thing I definitely wanted to throw out there, just to make sure that it was said, is aside from Lay, I think I'm the only one on the call with kids. I definitely want a hat tip to like ShmooCon and CCC and some of the other camps who have definitely made a tour camp who have definitely made a concerted effort to like make events family friendly. But there's a very interesting social nexus, and even inside that concept, between like family friendly typically just means safe, and everybody has different definitions of safe. And how do you walk that line? How do you make it safe enough to where people feel comfortable, and how do you make it, but without making it so safe that it's not fun? Because making it safe makes it unfree, right? And
More restrictions.
and I mean, and this is like Ben said earlier, this is one of those like I'll know it when I see it, but I can't tell you what it is kind of thing. Which just means we haven't defined it well enough. But I definitely had I was very conscious of the experience at one point. I was just literally walking in the woods with my 3-year-old, and it occurred to me that as much resource and effort goes into like tour camp, for example, to make sure that like there's childcare and people can enjoy themselves and kids are safe, I felt safer with my 3-year-old running around in the middle of the woods at disconnect camp, like almost recharged by the idea that like, yeah, you might run into somebody half drunk, and yeah, you might run into somebody like, you know, I don't know, messing around with ninja stars or something, or like you know, showing somebody else a firearm, but like not feeling like the area needed to have bumper cars on it to feel like my child was in any danger, and like I could still enjoy myself, right? Like it wasn't so safe that it was boring, but it wasn't so it wasn't so subjugated that like I had to put my kid over here and then daddy needs to go over here with the unsafe part so he can have fun. Like it was a perfect merger. And maybe that's just a number of people thing. Maybe it can't be duplicated, but it was just a unique feeling.
Do you,
like,
do you think that comes?
Those things at the same time.
Do you think that comes from the kind of the combination of like the disconnection from the outside world, but also the community? You know, kind of like the older events we were talking about. You know,
disconnection from the outside world is definitely part of it. I know you and I have talked about that previously, as the value of the camp events. Like that is definitely a thing. The idea that you can't just get in your car and go home, right? So people are committed to the experience.
Yeah.
There's definitely some personality there. Some very familiar faces to all of you were there, and some other previous goons, and there was definitely an empathy where like empathy kind of requires a lot of assumption typically because of the way that human communication works, but this was a kind of empathy where like other people have had similar experiences to you, so you can make kind of greater assumptions without subjectively being arrogant about the quote unquote vibe of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately it was just the intention. It was like it was very it was as pronounced as I feel like it could have been without it being explicit, that both the physical safety and the emotional safety of like you and yours, and the ability to like, I mean, I hate to use the word safe space, but like what that word actually means, not in a controlled way where no one is offended, but in a sense where like you are free to fail here, and no one will hold your failure against you as long as you are by consensus deemed to not be wishing ill of the others, right? Like it was a very like live and let live explicit state.
I wanted to mention, like Virus touched on it. It was one of the things he mentioned was that there was not non-authoritarian like vibes, right? And that's because I have so little rules of disconnect camp. And I should start this by saying this is not a challenge. This is just how I like to handle rules. My first rule is the primary rule of don't make me make more rules. That's literally the only rule I start with. And I did this for disconnect camp as well as the bottle shares that I was doing in any event that I do. My first rule is don't make me make new rules. That means you fucked up bad enough and you didn't fix it, that I had to make a rule to prevent people from doing this because I can't trust you. And yeah, so that's kind of like the whole vibe that I always go for. By the way, there are 2 more rules for disconnect camp. One is you cannot go in the kitchen, like period. And there's a story behind it, and there's a person behind that rule. And I think the other one is you're not allowed to tear apart the fireplace. And unfortunately, there's also a story and a person for that rule.
I mean,
What?
I really appreciate the purity of that rule structure though. Like the first rule is amazing. Yes, don't make me make more rules. And then literally every rule that follows can be tied directly to an activity or a story, right? It's like the same way that you should go and critically analyze all law that we have in the real world. It's like the same concept, just at a micro scale, which is amazing. That's awesome.
It's borrowed from the U.S. system. Like, a previous court case can determine the next court case. Like, yeah, you should expect that. Yeah, tearing apart the fireplace gets you kind of banned. Like, you're not allowed to, which, by the way, you're welcome back. Who did that? I love you, man, but you can't tear apart the fireplaces.
I'm so curious about why someone tore apart a fireplace, but I don't want to make you have to call
Chatterhouse
anyone
rules
out.
have to apply. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Chatterhouse rules applies. It can be discussed. Can be discussed at disconnect camp. I think there's also the Chatterhouse rules, which is like, what's discussed up here, just keep it up here, because, yeah, like Virus said, that people are getting shit off their chest, and that was kind of why I started the whole camp, right? I was applying and making something that I felt I had needed when I had my complete breakdown, and like I just flipped off the whole system. I said, I'm out. And when I came back, I'm like, no, I needed to have a camp or a place that I could talk to my peers who understand, like we have like minds, like we understand the complexities of, what we're trying to get into. And yeah, so I basically built Disconnect Camp for that. And I did the podcast for a while too, which is now in, intermission for like 2 years now. But if people want to find that, you can find it from the Disconnect Camp website. It's fireside.disconnect.camp will be the website. But
so what other sorts of activities or stuff did they have at the last Disconnect camp? Just to give people who aren't familiar with it an idea.
Well, every camp's going to be different, and it depends on who I can convince to put in time and effort. And I think any good event, especially hacker events, it's all about the volunteers who stepped up to make all the extra shit. At the end of the day, I'm mostly the guy passing around money to make it look legitimate, enough like I'm collecting money from one person to pay off the food and like the venues, and I'm handling the insurance and all the liability. But the event last year had it's like a scavenger hunt type thing. It was a scavenger hunt / CTF type thing. Previous years, I did have a CTF with like Wi-Fi and everything. I didn't like that too much because it required somebody to pop out a laptop. But people had fun with it. I try to get some sort of game running in the background. So if you got nothing to do and you like cracking codes, you can go ahead and do that. Previous years, we had things like a lockpicking village kind of show up and run a little village just to have a space there. We do most of the talks this year were kind of indirectly like mental health focused, like I mentioned. So one of the things I gave was a demo for Zen in the Art of Lockpicking, where I just gave the example of like approach lockpicking like Zen, and just like it's not about picking the lock, it's not about that success you feel. It's just do the process and keep working through it. And pay attention to your emotional state, and like that's what was it is doing meditation and lockpicking combined.
I can totally relate with that. Working as a locksmith for a number of years, there's a rhythm and a flow that you can get into when you're picking locks, especially if you do a bunch of days in a row. It's kind of like in sports they call it getting into the zone or something. Sometimes you just know you're feeling it. You've done a lot of locks lately. You walk up to one and you just feel it out, and there's a zen to it for sure.
One of the things I really liked about the last camp is there was this kind of unspoken vibe where people, like all the community participation elements, like most people felt that it was appropriate for their presentation or their contribution to be of what their Zen was, so that other people could learn from it. Like it wasn't necessarily my bag, but one of the things I just really liked even being around was Fun Size, who's a attendee, who decided that he was going to do a workshop on painting Warhammer figures. Which, I mean, when I say it, yeah, you could, like, I'm describing something very pedantic and nerdy, but he was very clear that, like, hey, I'm not saying this because I'm a big Warhammer nerd. Like, I'm actually not. I barely know the lore. I just really like painting the little figures, and it's a very Zen process for me. And I can explain to you what that Zen process is for me. If you want to sit next to me while I paint, you're welcome. And people who had no nerd background at all, like, you know, the quote unquote the wives and the children, and they had, I mean, it was at one point there were 6 people. They're all just sitting there painting in total silence and figuring out if it was their zen. I mean, I sat next to them and the vibe was so cool. I just read a book the whole and had a beautiful experience just reading a book. It was great.
So it's not necessarily that you had some kind of top-down notion of how people should be dealing with their burnout or infosec PTSD or whatever you want to call it. It was more just that you created a space and set an intention, and then let everybody kind of bring their own angle to it. Yep. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. I mean, like, I don't think that there's any like one solution for a problem. Like if one person has a burnout issue or a mental health issue, they've got one solution for them, but nope, there's 1,000 different opportunities of what that solution could be. You know, who knows what it'll be. That's why, bringing people together in the camp, the venue is like, the intention there is like, you don't have to stress about anything. You don't have to think about what to get for lunch because like somebody's just going to make lunch for you.
Yeah.
And like if you're vegetarian or have dietary needs, like take care of it. Like let me know ahead of time, and like I make sure that you got something set aside. And people are just left with their own selves, you know, like, and you've got to figure out what to do. One of the people there was going off meditating next to the river, because there's this river that runs through the whole area. So he's like, I'm going to go over there and meditate. I'm like, okay, go. Like, he's like, do I don't have to ask permission? I'm like, no, like there's no permission. Just go do a thing. You know, if you want to go running, people went on hikes, people went for runs. You're free to do whatever it is you wanted to do. And I provide like the minimal, you know, there's stuff to keep you entertained if you're bored. But there's like an arcade machine there. And some people set up videos, I think. Like, I think they have like a VHS tape deck. So somebody remembered how that technology works and got the CRT monitor running probably off RCA cables and just like, was watching like Jurassic Park. Some weird old school movie.
The dining hall had just a stack of board games, like a massive stack of board games.
Yeah.
And there was always at least 2 people just sitting there playing a board game.
It sounds like crowdsourced infosec therapy.
Yeah.
It's open-ended therapy. Yeah, it was really good. I do remember one event was an unscheduled event. It was the car getting stuck in the river, which that was a peak event for me. Peak experience there. Middle of the night. We're drinking, just commiserating stories or whatever. It's kind of dying down right around this. I think we were in the lodge with the fire in the fireplace. We're just chilling, and then somebody busts in.
Shine to everyone, so we were very flushed.
Somebody busts in. And he's like, who's got I forgot what they asked. Like, who's got a car jack, or can somebody like tow us out of the river? Like, what? We're like, what's going on? We go out and somebody got a Honda Civic stuck in. There's a river. You've got to drive through the river, and it's about 2 inches deep, and they got their car stuck in it.
It was Ice Tray.
Yes, it was Ice Tray.
And then it was that kid from CCDC who had a Subaru, who was like, I'll get him unstuck, and then he got stuck.
I didn't see that part. That was great. Yeah, that sounds about right. And then the tractor came. No, it was the bulldozer came because they were doing repairs. So like this guy just rolls up in a bulldozer. We go out there and like somebody's reading the manual for the Honda Civic and like finding out there's a tow point, like there's a hitch point for the tow in the front, and like we're digging up like rocks and like mounting the tow point, and like this guy with this like bucket arm bulldozer thing like lifts him up and pulls him drags him out of the river. And like I look back and it's like the whole event is there now because there's this big commotion. Like people are looking for like shovels and things to pull the car out with, and the Subaru got stuck and got unstuck, and everybody's there and everybody's like cheering on. And then I think I remember it was I don't know if I should name names. Virus can confirm if whom I'm going to talk about would be okay with this. But I certainly think you'd be okay with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Then so Merlin, who was there helping, Merlin was in the car too, I think. But anyways, he gets up and he's helping, and he ends up riding the bucket of the bulldozer back through the river on his way back. He's like, I don't want to get wet, so they pick him up in the bucket and like ride him through. And there's actually a piece of artwork done for that. That's part of like the disconnect camp lore from the last event. Was Merlin riding,
sitting in the bucket? He's the second hacker I've ever seen getting a ride across rough terrain in a bulldozer. The first being Tommy Pickles being drunk as hell, pissing off the back of a snowplow.
Nice. Yeah, and that event is when I think it keyed in as a peak event for Disconnect Camp because of the mentality of most hackers to be fixers, right? Like when something's broken or something's wrong, a lot of us like have that mentality of I'm going to jump in and try to fix it. And they were just everybody was there because everybody was looking for something they could do to help. And that was like a nice little side event.
Where was the physical location of that one?
It's up near Big Bear in California, Southern California. So yeah, it's up in the mountains. It was cold. It was rainy. It was wet, but it was nice.
I got to drive a Tesla over a river. It was fun.
You didn't short out the batteries. We had at least one car a prior year, slip a timing belt through the river. Ooh. Like the water kicked up, slipped the timing belt loose. And he's like, oh, something's wrong. Because it's only 20 more feet to park. And in that 20 feet, it's like, something's wrong. And we ended up popping the hood and with whatever tools we had available, reconnecting the guy's timing belt and getting everything back in order.
Jeez. Wow.
Thanks.
That's awesome. Well, I think with that, we're going to take a break and we'll be back with more about Disconnect Camp with Lay in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much. Hey, this is Ben from Symbol Crash. While we're on break, I wanted to share some updates. We have a new YouTube channel at youtube.com/symbolcrash, spelled SYMBOL Crash. We have all our episodes up there with an awesomely hypnotic video loop made by our very own Virus. We don't do ads because as working security professionals, we don't need your money. But we do ask that you like and subscribe, or if you're like me, you're too paranoid and annoyed by advertising to browse while logged into anything. Maybe tell a friend about us and have them do it. You can also have your friend follow SymbolCrash1 on Twitter, or check out our site at symbolcrash.com for the links we post for each episode and the occasional blog post or online event we run, including the monthly hardware hacking workshop. We're also doing a survey. What is the biggest what the fuck you've seen on an engagement? Either the funniest or scariest thing you've seen so far. Leave us an audio email, tell us your story, at podcast@symbolcrash.com, or call the Hacker Helpline and leave a message at 206-486-6272. When we get enough of these stories together, we'll do a What the Fuck episode, and we'll share some of our stories, and it'll be a good time. And now, back to our regularly programmed schedule. And we're back with Lay, former Defcon goon and founder of the Disconnect Camp. So my first question after the break, and this might be a little bit loaded given the COVID situation and all that, but when is the next Disconnect Camp going to be?
Yeah, that is to be determined at this point. I am conscious of it in an event where people get together and meet space, and even though it'd be technical outdoors, it's not going to be happening right now. So you'd have to go to the website disconnect.camp or check out Twitter, Disconnect Camp on Twitter. Follow it there, and normally about 3 to 6 months ahead of time, I'll start posting when I have a venue starting to get together. I'll do little tidbits, like I normally post pictures of a bear. When the Twitter when the Twitter feed is active, it means that work is being done, and that means I've got a venue and I'm starting to put the pieces together.
Oh, great. So stay tuned for that. So now that we're on the subject of 2020 as a topic, our our last big subject for this episode. So you had a tweet recently that was kind of interesting about sort of what you learned from 2020. Sort of on the subject of, big T truth and little T truth. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I didn't bring up the tweet, but yeah, it was roughly the observation that I had that in 2020, there's this big divergence of people believing what truth is and what truth is, right? And the difference is the spelling, is I put a big T or a little t. And big T truth is basically objective truth, things that can be proven based on scientific process, right? And analysis, verification of facts and evidence. And little T truth, only is subjective truth, and that only needs to be repeated enough in order to become true to people. And there's the difficulty in 2020, or what I learned, was that people have really hard time differentiating the two. They fall into that habit of just kind of being lazy, and if I heard it enough, it's good enough for me to start, putting that truth, that little t truth that I'm hearing a lot, into my worldview. And any individual in the world, it falls victim to this, and they just collect a lot of little t truths, and they make this imaginary world that they think they live in. And then some fucked up shit starts to happen.
Well, it kind of goes back to the speaker you had at the Disconnect camp, who was talking about social engineering, or what I was calling the cognitive miser theory. Like, people don't like to spend a lot of cognitive cycles, reevaluating everything all the time. So they tend to sort of make shortcuts.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, we all fall into this. We all fall into this process.
In my experience, a lot of it's been fear driven. Because people like the problem with big T truths, right, is that we don't have them for everything, and so people tend to be very insecure subjectively. I find that hackers kind of have to be a little bit more secure than most people, because like you can't spend a lifetime telling others that the emperor has no clothes unless you have some self-substantiation in my experience / opinion, but that's obviously another topic. But like
we have pox. We can prove it. We've got a piece of code we can run that does it. Therefore, it must be true.
But that's kind of, I mean, that's the point, right? Is that it's like, it sounds silly, but it's actually kind of a big deal, right? Like people, I find where this divide gets the greatest is like, well, if I have to have objective proof for everything, then I don't have a way to prove the nature of good and bad. And that means that I don't have a way to tell myself that I'm a good person. I can't prove it. So at some point I have to give myself credence to just know things, because I have to just know good from bad at some basic level. Me being the people who subscribe to little T truths. And so my experience / judgment is very much that it's a fear-based, I guess, Boolean that people flip, some consciously, arguably most unconsciously, but it's very much a like, things have to be true and I have to be able to believe them to be true that aren't provable, because if they aren't, then I have no mechanism for showing that I am in fact a good person, and then I don't know how to deal with myself.
Although, I mean, well, I know that hackers also do the cognitive miser thing, and we also create these like false reality tunnels that allow us to stay sane. Because I do this myself, and my best example of this is when I started out in infosec. I don't know, like more than 10 years ago. I used to be just a developer, but when I started out in infosec, I was like, oh, there's certain sorts of bugs that exist in code, and all we have to do is enumerate all of them, educate all the developers on all of the bugs, make tools to find all of the bugs, and then this whole industry will go away in 5 years or something, and I'll go back to being a developer. Yeah, no time at all, and I'll go back to being a developer with all of these problems solved, right? And although that lie has morphed a little bit over the years, it's still, there's some version of that is kind of keeping me going, and on some level I know that that's not true. Like if I set out to do an experiment, I can prove that this is not true.
Well, so one point I wanted to kind of throw out there is that it's interesting listening to both of you kind of frame your thinking about this, because I kind of feel like my concept ties these together, in that the when you're talking about, I don't know how to, the individuals not knowing how to conceive, like how to think of themselves without some form of subjective determination that I am good, right? to me, that is a form of intellectual laziness, right? It takes a lot of work to analyze every situation, every interaction that you have, right? It takes a lot of work to try and empathize with the people that you're interacting with constantly. It is a form of cognitive laziness, right? To make that objective or that subjective decision, I am a good person, so by virtue, most of the decisions I make, even though it's really in my own self-interest, are probably good because I'm a good person, right? And that's that cognitive trap that's so easy for everybody to fall into. I feel the cognitive miser topic and the fear-based topic, they're actually directly related. And the thing that's really funny about that is that when you try to apply, like when you're in a professional setting and you're trying to understand the why behind a problem, it almost always devolves into some like very subjective, very human like origin that has nothing to do with the technical problem that you're going to address, which is why, we're not done by lunch enumerating the technical aspects of the issue. So
I mean, I guess I would argue that what you're saying makes sense, but it comes from the perspective of someone who values objective truth over arguably their sense of self, which I'm not. I don't disagree. Like, I'm that way too, but I feel like I'm in good conscience forced to recognize that, like, it feels like laziness to me too, but I can't prove that. Right. I have no evidence that is in fact more relevant than self-substantiation, for lack of more explanation. This is why the way that I typically phrase this is in terms of consensus, right? Because what is objective truth? Well, objective truth is also just distribution of an idea, right? But it's so the way I've explained this to people in the past is I say, well, the difference between capital T truth and little t truth is like capital T truth is it only requires consensus of observation. Little t truth requires consensus of reason, right? And so the quick example is so 10 people are looking up in the sky and they see a red flash of light, okay, and 9 people say, so somebody comes and an investigator comes and asks those 10 people, what'd you see? And 10 people say, I saw a red flash in the sky. And the one person says, I saw a dragon. Okay, well, you need people to concede that they experienced seeing red and looking at what they perceived as the sky for consensus of the observation. The person who says they say a dragon isn't provably wrong, but in order for them to be right, we need to first agree that there was a red flash in the sky, and then we need to have consensus, right, that the red flash was the result of a dragon, right? And a more tangible example I give sometimes is how do you I can tell you that like murder is wrong, but like I don't have a way to prove it, right? But like, how do I prove that this stick is an inch? Well, I can name this stick an inch and I can hand it to you, and you can take it and hold it up to something else that you decide is an inch for whatever differential language differences we have. And at some point you can argue with terminology or say this is the wrong expression, but we can say that 1 unit of stick right, is equal to a thing I held it up to. And now we have consensus of observation. And this consensus of observation is literally the foundation of all of human reason. And by extension of that, like all of science, right? But it is just still consensus. It's just consensus of observation versus consensus of reason.
I think there's another kind of almost tangential problem though, where so people in infosec, maybe there's a lot more people in infosec that actually have trouble being cognitive misers. Like even in social situations, they'll do way too much freaking analysis all the time and they'll tear themselves apart analytically. And so what I was thinking when you were just saying that is that an inch is a terrible example because there is a gold inch in a box in France somewhere that is degrading. It's losing molecules every year. And that's why they invented the metric system, so that you could rederive, the meter from, measurable, physical, physics things that don't change, so that you don't have to keep this golden inch, from degrading, right? So the inch is actually, not an inch. The inch now is not the inch it was hundreds of years ago, right? And when a non sort of scientific person hears that, they'll say, well, see, science is bullshit, right? And so I think that like the sort of people that are, sort of intellectually eating themselves alive all the time to continuously re-verify the things they think they know, there's a disconnect between that and when you're trying to communicate with people that just want a simple truth, so they can stop thinking about it.
Well, the point is all truths are simple, but it's whether or not they validate. Because like the inch problem is like, no, you're absolutely right. That inch is losing molecules by the day. But do I care? I don't have to care if my goal is not to measure something to an actual inch, but my goal is to communicate the concept of an inch to another person. For that, I just need something that they agree is an inch.
Right. It's about agreement, right? So when you come to a consensus, then it's a success. You have a successful consensus, which is sort of an absolute truth. It's a relative absolute truth.
It's building a truth between peoples, right? So then you can add more people and everybody can agree that this is the size of an inch. And then later on, right, and that's a subjectively objective claim, right? So like everybody agrees that this is the size of an inch. Subjectively, they agree. Objectively, this is the size. And then later on, right, somebody could come up and be like, hey, by the way, like this is losing molecules. Like we can measure it. And like over the 100 years, we could be like, oh, it actually changed. And then you can start reevaluating. And that's the key thing that I kind of like thinking of as adaptability. You've got to be able to say, an objective truth allows adaptability, allows you to say, I am wrong because more evidence has come forward. Not, I'm wrong because more people started saying a different truth, right? More people weren't loud about it. And that's the key difference between the two as well.
But the relevance there is what Ben was talking about earlier, which is where that works as long as truth is still defined as something that can be observed by our senses at some level, right? Once we leave that and we go into the higher brain functions and we start talking about reason and we need consensus of reason, the problem with reason is that it's not objectively measurable enough yet for it to not be gamified. And this is the problem, right? It's unless you've got a VR helmet on, we don't know how to gamify consensus of observation, but we very, very much know how to gamify consensus of reason.
Yeah.
Well, if people are just like counting the number of times they heard something stated as truth, right? Like Facebook has made an enormous amount of money by gaming that system essentially. And people using Facebook as a means of disseminating propaganda have swayed vast chunks of the population into believing things that are quite easily disproven, And I don't necessarily want to call out like QAnon or whatever, because frankly, I don't know enough of the details. But if you take like there's some things like the moon landing, where there's a large number of people that don't believe, the humans have landed on the moon. When they dropped a freaking mirror there, you can literally hit with a laser yourself, and you can detect that there's a mirror on the moon that is reflecting light energy from your laser from the Earth using about less than $200 worth of stuff. Right? There was a MythBusters episode on this.
Over 1.5 million people believe the Earth is flat.
Yeah, and I was like, don't even get me started on the flat Earth thing, but like, I don't know if these people have just never been up in an airplane, but there's this whole like, once you believe a thing, it is easier to discount all new information than it is to change your beliefs, right? So you start getting into this, there's a global conspiracy to convince you that it's not a round dome on a flat surface, right? Or that it is a round dome that it's not a round dome on a flat surface, that it's, like rather than like, maybe the world is round, You know.
So why was there such a resurgence of it? Because, I mean, there's always been people that have believed this.
Well,
but
I think that just alluded to it. I mean, his example was, well, I don't know how many of these people have never been up in an airplane. Well, right there, you're giving credence to the propensity that these people's version of true, the Earth being flat, was garnered from consensus of observation, from what they saw. They saw the Earth is flat, and if they've never been in an airplane, then they think the Earth is always flat. But if you go in an airplane, as we have all been, you can see to some degree the curvature of the Earth, right? But that's not where that definition of truth came from. That definition came from reason and came from things that they absorbed socially, right?
Like a giant Facebook group with thousands of people repeating that the Earth is flat,
or a YouTube poll or whatever. But the point here is, it didn't even most people who believe the Earth is round have not taken lasers and bounced them off the atmosphere and made sure that the experiments make sense, right? Like, most people absorb, they don't. This goes back to what you were saying earlier. Like, people are built to absorb information on faith. They're not doing the work themselves. They're not. If they see evidence of that challenge, they're gonna take the consensus of reason over the consensus of observation, because the consensus of reason gets them farther, right? It's the same reason why people go down occult holes or religious holes or get super into acupuncture and crystals and stuff like that. Obviously, yeah, there's studies and not all of that stuff is hocus pocus. We just don't understand it yet. But there's a lot of other stuff where it's well, no, but the consensus of reason says that this solves these 20 other problems, even though there's no evidence for that, right? Their reality is not based on what they measure.
So it's easy to dunk on a lot of these, things that are obviously far-fetched, but on this topic, I'm interested in some of the more sort of borderline claims. One that's really common with COVID is that the death counts are overstated because hospitals want the money when they call a death or an illness a COVID death, because there's some extra grant money from the NIH or whomever is responsible for allocating the increased funding. Or you'll hear, one anecdote will go viral where you have, they say, my mom or aunt died and it wasn't COVID related, but they put COVID on the death certificate and it's counted as a COVID death. And so that's one sort of you have this whole sort of group that sort of bases their worldview around this idea that there's, a intent to intensify the pandemic for purposes of either social control or monetary gain. And then you have a whole different group of people who are looking at sort of the excess death count, where basically you look at the number of people who would have died in a year, and you graph that over time, and you can see that it's plausible that the death totals understate the actual COVID death toll. The official counts might be understating what the actual entire total death toll of specific things related to COVID. And you just have these two different sets of reasoning that lead people to have entirely different viewpoints about something that you think we might be able to come to an objective truth on. And, it sort of spirals out from there in a lot of other ways about, do masks work or do they not work? Does shutting down businesses actually have any effect? And a lot of people have talked about this, but I might as well bring it up. There's the idea of, trust the science has been something that there's a lot of talk now about the difference between things that can be scientifically proven and those things which, do involve objective or subjective reasoning, like how do you allocate, vaccines in a priority order? And so all of those things, are very... I don't know how to reconcile them, and I've kind of given up. I've kind of just basically accepted the fact that people are going to have entirely different epistemologies of the pandemic and how it played out, and that probably people will be even writing different histories of the pandemic, and I've just kind of accepted that. And I don't know what to do about it.
As someone who's obsessively tracked the U.S. morbidity data, for the last 20 years, mostly because I like people to understand that cars are a lot more dangerous than they think. But I know that they never publish the morbidity index until at least 2 years later. And that means like science will not come to a final conclusion on any of those questions for at least 2 years. And the problem this year is that all of these questions are immediate life or death problems for everybody, right? There's an enormous amount of fear involved, and there aren't any real answers, right? Like a study comes out, says one thing, a study comes out, says another thing. There were incidences early last year where they redid how they were counting COVID deaths to try and make it more accurate, in a couple of places. And we're not really going to have any kind of scientific consensus on most of those for at least 2 years. They're going to have to go back once the data has actually been gathered for this year, which it hasn't yet. And then they're going to have to grind over the data a lot before they reach any sort of conclusion. And this is like, everyone's super amped up, everyone's super scared, and nobody, everybody is desperate for some kind of answer, to know the truth, and they're just really, you can go with whatever study came out last month that seems the most credible, or you can go with what everybody is repeating on Facebook, right? And a long timeline, the actual answer is probably somewhere in between, right? It's probably closer to whatever the most credible study was rather than what random people are saying on Facebook, but,
I do want to point out something about, I talked to several doctors, as you know, one of my good friends is an oncologist in Missoula. There is a huge issue with the hospital administration, man. They do not care about quality of patient care.
Ooh,
all they
that's a
care
big
about
claim.
is the bottom dollar. Well, I've heard it from a lot of doctors, and that I have not seen it myself. I've heard other doctors say this, and it sounds really depressing. It sounds like that basically you have people at the top who are trying to make the most money they possibly can for their hospital, and don't really give a shit about the patient's,
there's a totally different thread which is about like the perverse incentives in American healthcare, which existed before this year, and there's probably an argument to be made that is not how we should be doing healthcare, and one would have hoped that this, the absolute, no matter which side of the belief you're on, I don't think anyone believes that the American healthcare system has handled this particularly well, right? So you'd think, well, if we all agree on that, like maybe we could make some changes, but
There's also something to be said about, and that we're very dog-legged at this point, but there's also something to be said about errors at scale. So I have a lot of doctors in my family. I have a lot of teachers in my family. And you're both right. So I can feel the dissent from Mitchell. And you're absolutely right. And there's a very similar environment in teaching when it comes to with the way teachers unions work. And the problem is, to be as concise as possible, like Ben said, success is not incentivized well. And so as a result, hospital administrators are forced to compensate in ways that sometimes abjectly affect patient care. Because if, like, on the one hand, it's easy to clump in the, money grubber with being callous or being impersonal towards human life. But another way to think about that is, if you're the administrator of a hospital, hospitals in this country are a for-profit entity. No one's coming to save you if you go out of business. So if you are the significant healthcare provider for a group of people in a given area, that's equivalent to if you can't figure out a way to gamify getting your school funded, then a whole bunch of kids in your area just don't get school, right? And that's terrible, but like there's a lot of legitimacy in those incentives, right? Like you as a human want to be ambitious and make your money, and also you as a human don't, want to provide for your fellow human, right? But also like you got to get stuff done, right? Like these the three sides of this triangle are all legitimate. It's not like we can just say, well, everyone should do the best all the time and they should overkill, because what if that negatively affects someone and then they go out of business tomorrow? Like that's a real threat.
I'd also like to point out that we literally just did the thing we were talking about a few minutes earlier, right? Where like, everybody's freaked out, and there aren't really good sources of, big T truth on any of these topics. And so, you reach for one piece of anecdotal information from here, or, something from there, and you try and get by with that. Right. And, I think it's just naturally uncomfortable to admit that you don't know something, especially if it's something important, and I think that is why so many more people seem to be believing, strange things this year than even last year. And I'd like to point out that, going back like 4 or 5 years, we thought this was like, the Facebook propaganda thing was like starting to create these giant movements of people that believed weird stuff that's easy to dunk on, right? That's kind of like where it got rolling, like, the flat Earth stuff.
Flat Earth.
Yeah. But this year, suddenly, all of these things are life and death, and it's, I think it's really raised the question, like, how do we, as people that are, more inclined to analyze everything to death and be obsessed with, proof of concept stuff, like, on the subject of, burnout, like infosec burnout last year was already a problem, but then you add to that this year, just like social burnout from being surrounded by people that are spouting all kinds of stuff that they believe strongly, but they can't back up, right? It's not just infosec anymore. Now it's everything, right? So
It is. It's rough.
I guess what I'm wondering is like how, like, if we weren't really coping with our little niche of the world before, like, how are we supposed to cope with this?
The canvas of the tent got heavier, but the tent pole stayed the same size.
I'm curious what Lay thinks since he posed the question.
Yeah.
I really like the tent analogy, because I mean, if anything, my tent pole got stronger after I had this big fuck up in my own life before all this shit happened in 2020. And I kind of now was like, in 2019, I was like, what the fuck am I going to use any of the suppression shit that I've been dealing with, right? Like how terrible my life was, and I was kind of like turning it around. And then 2020 came, and honestly, I was like, oh, yeah, I can turn my back on everybody. I've done that before. Like, I come out okay. I know at the other end, like, not socializing, and rebuild. It means I get to rebuild a worldview, right? I get to rebuild all my experiences, and I get to kind of choose new friends or really gravitate towards different people. And that's kind of like it's what I kind of look at it as. I got kind of lucky by getting so fucked beforehand. Like in 2019, it was way worse. It was about 2017 or 2016 was way worse for me. Like that was the standing on a bridge year for me. Not to get too deep, but like this year has been much better because I built out a ton of coping mechanisms for these sort of things, like not social distancing, because that's got a new term, forced social distancing, when like you're outed from an entire group and you have no friends anymore. And I'm like, fuck it, like I'm done. So using the skill sets that I had from there, as I was able to build on my year this year and work with that. I also have other experiences that I know objective truths about. When you guys mentioned like Facebook and social media turning people into crazy people based on these little t truths that they're hearing constantly. I don't know if y'all did this in like the early 2000s, but I ran forums and I seeded forums with fake information to attract people to join the forum so I can get money from advertisers, right? So I wanted to make communities back before Reddit and Facebook and social media was a thing. And I built communities that were interacting with me using me as in like 20 accounts. Like I'd post from 20 different accounts and people would interact with me, one person all day long. And they had no idea. I mean, yeah.
There's a whole segment here at some future point. That's really cool. Yeah. We could make something out of that.
I mean, it's like, that's my little like dark secret because I just did it for the money. You know, I just created a community, sold advertisers, and I was like, and I don't think that that's too far off from what's happening today. I'm not in the nitty gritty about social media takeovers or account creations or like group creations, but I'm pretty sure they're following the same similar tactics. One person can represent multitudinals, almost infinite people, and you can just script out bullshit to say all day long. And once one of those things hits, you start getting more people, and then they just self-aggregate themselves. The forums that in the communities I ran, they just ran themselves after about a year of bullshit information from me running 20 accounts. And nobody noticed when like those 20 posters that posted every day just disappear. Because now it's all self-aggregating. They're posting their own content. They're going back and forth. And I'm sure that these people are like intentionally driving a force to build a group that's going to be highly like conspiratorial minded. And they're just going to like support those people. Oh, that's a crazy idea you've got. Yeah, fuck yeah, that's a crazy idea I've got here too. Lizard people, you know, Earth's flat. And they build off of each other. And yeah, these platforms are doing it for money. And I mean, again, I say that from my perspective is objective because I personally did that. You know, like I know exactly how it works, and it totally works.
I think I keep thinking Facebook's going to die, but now they're working on like new virtual reality stuff to integrate to it. So it's not with hand motion capture stuff. It's just not dying. It won't die. It won't. I don't know.
I love the lizard people one though, because that's like that. Even if I don't believe it, it feels real. You know.
Well, it's one of the more interesting ones, I guess.
Well, no, but I mean, it's like it's almost like a metaphor, right? Like as a metaphor, that sounds about right. But
I think an interesting metric to measure this is, like Ben said earlier, he was like, "Well, wait, we all just did that. Like we all just cling to a thing we heard." Well, I think this is one of the places where a valuable metric, at least in my experience, is the why behind the communicative technology being used. And when I say that, I mean language, not like Zoom or talking to someone, but I mean like the actual method of communicating to other humans. I feel like when we went around the room, metaphorically speaking, talking about our COVID understandings and Darthesis, that we were talking that each of us was in the experience of offering the best data we could, right? We were saying, I looked up in the sky and I saw a red flash, or I saw a green flash, or I saw 2 blue flashes. And yeah, sometimes those things don't add up and they don't end in a big T truth. But I think all of us I have consensus of reason that the motivation of all of us is to achieve consensus of observation. And so when we speak like that, we're offering data to the fray, take it or leave it, believe what you may, right? And that trust, which can be dangerous in the right hands, is the intuitive leaps sometimes necessary for science to occur, right? Because we need something to test, right? And as long as all of us are committed to the idea that it's not true until we have that data, we're free to bullshit just like everyone else is free to bullshit. But as soon as there's an observable consensus, we will all choose that over our bullshit. That is subjectively what I feel like can give our versions of bullshit value, right? Like
we have to hope that everybody does agree.
Yeah, it's like I trust that you guys are getting your data from feeds. I mean, I've got a cousin who's literally a reality TV doctor, right? And like I've got a mom who was a teacher for 40 years who was also a union representative, and her dad was on the LA school board for 40 years, and like the anecdotes that I said about education and doctoring, like, okay, they're anecdotes because they are my experiences, but that is me recanting like the experiences of like 80 years in both directions of a field of study that I know nothing about. So like maybe I'm wrong and maybe it's wrong, but I'm offering it to the fray in terms of that was my consensus of observation. That's not what my reasoning was, right? And I trust that everyone else is doing the same thing. And I don't think that based on our other conversation that everybody on Facebook is doing that, right? Like some of them are 20 accounts trying to get community engagement on a forum, right?
And is it reasonable to expect everyone to do that?
Well, so it's kind of against broader human nature to do that. Like most humans want to be cognitive misers. This has been demonstrated by decades of psychology grad student experiments. This is it's if you can find the same results by reproducing the same experiment on any group of people for the most part. Right, it's why stage magic works. It's been well understood by certain segments of the population for hundreds of years. Like people see what they expect to see most of the time, and that's there's an old saying, believe none of what you hear and half of what you see, right? And yeah, some people, live by that, and some people don't, I guess. But
what if what you hear is good music?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to figure out this year, right, is how do I cope in this world, right, where it's not just a matter of armchair bullshit, oh, we didn't land on the moon, it was a soundstage, that James Bond movie is proof or whatever. It's like, no, like now it's like if I can go out in the woods and maybe I'm wearing a mask because I figure it doesn't do any harm and it probably does some good, right? And then what's the harm, right? So I'm like, what? Sure, fucking install the antivirus. Right, I don't necessarily believe it works that well, but it's not hurting anybody, Okay, maybe Norton is full of bugs, and that's a bad example, but I'm too far in now, right? Yeah. But if I'm out, if I'm out in the woods, right, walking with my dog, I wear a mask. Like I've been assaulted by Trump supporters on several occasions this year, who will like run up on me and be like, why are you wearing a mask? Like all angry about it, right? Yep. Like what difference does it make to them? They've been.
Well, it is.
Why are they being aggressive about it towards you? Like,
there's a reason.
Problematic.
Right? Yeah. You've made an affront to their worldview, right? Their beliefs are like they're afraid, probably, right? I don't know really what the reasoning is, but something led them to not want coronavirus to be a thing. Now, the way I don't want coronavirus to be a thing, by the way, like this year is COVID-19, like I do not want that to be a thing, but I adjusted my worldview and my expectations of the world around me, right? So I'll go out wearing a mask. It helps that I lived in Asia and I've never seen a problem with masks, especially in like public. Like they work and people get sick a lot less. So I'm like, cool. We get to wear masks this year. I skipped a flu shot. When everybody's like, get a flu shot, I'm like, actually, I'm going to wear a mask everywhere. I'm probably at a reduced risk. Also, I don't go out. But you're basically like, by wearing the mask, you're reminding them that they should, and it's an affront to the things that they like in life. Like they wanted to be able to go out and go to the bar and go to do a restaurant and like put their kids in school all day long and so they can sit at home and do whatever it is they do. And it's just you've created an aggression response caused by, and I'm going to step back here, from frustration that they have, and the frustration they have is that their worldview was shattered, right? The beliefs that they held, right? They thought everything is honky-dory. You go out and party, you say, yeah, America, fuck yeah, who cares? But they're wrong, right? And they're frustrated because they're wrong, and they keep being told that they're wrong. And then they take that frustration out in a form of aggression. And that's towards you, who just so happened to be, in the middle of this forest wearing a mask, like you became the target. And that's scarily how people work.
I look forward to wearing a mask a lot in the future.
So
I'm going to keep wearing a mask for years. I'm super into it.
I think there's a deeper response that's happening, and a lot of it I've seen is sort of like if you've read the book in 1984, there was a feeling that you got reading that book. There's like, oh, there's this totalitarian state, right? And I'm not saying that's the only way people can get that feeling, but I'm just trying to evoke the image of like, imagine you thought that the world was headed towards something like that.
Sure.
And I've seen on Facebook in a lot of people who think of masks as a form of social control. And if they can convince you, this tall guy with a dog who has nothing to probably be afraid of, that you want to give up control that easily, that could, what does that say about the broader society that you're living in? Or like, you would give up the right to provide for your family by running a restaurant or a gym or something.
Yeah, I don't think they don't understand that we want to wear masks.
Well, no, I don't think that's
even after COVID.
I disagree with that. I actually was going to build on both of those ideas and try to play devil's advocate without playing devil's advocate. So if I were to answer Ben's original question, like, why does this random person feel the need to walk up to me and give me comments about what I choose to do with my time? It's probably going to ruffle some feathers, and I'm not necessarily saying these things by consensus of observation are literally equal, but one could make the argument for the same reason that an extreme social justice minded left wing person is going to punch a Nazi or someone with Nazi memorabilia on them. At the end of the day, if they're not aggressing against you, they're just walking around with a symbol you don't like. Now, yes, we could talk about the history of the symbols and what that means, but all of that is circumstantial evidence, right? And so this right-wing person is as free as that left-wing person to decide that you wearing a mask in the scenario that you're in is circumstantial evidence for other things. And both of these things are true, at least at some level. They're very deeply afraid and disturbed by the idea that their worldview is so wrong that someone in the middle of the woods is taking care for something that they truly need to not exist because they've built a life on the idea that it doesn't exist, right? And they need to see themselves as a good person. So them leaving you alone means they have to go to sleep at night and, on the best case, either say, well, that person just, chooses to do something that may or may not be a detriment to them, and I didn't choose to interfere because it's not my place, and that's on them, right? And now we have the ban. Like, if you were like, a woman in the woods screaming, like, same situation but different social context on what's considered appropriate, right? Versus like, well, I'm gonna say something because at least I can say that I said something, and it's like it's really difficult because the id doesn't matter. Like, whether or not it's someone wearing a mask, whether or not it's someone with a Nazi emblem, whether or not it's someone who looks like they're being sexual assaulted, whether or not it's someone crying in a corner in a bar, like, fundamentally what we're talking about is a commitment to the truth at a level of we're available to be wrong in our read of the situation and to then take whatever action we take forward, versus I am not available to be wrong, because if I'm wrong, then I don't know who I am. I don't know that right is right and wrong is wrong. I have no proof to back up my worldview, and all of my central universe starts to collapse. That's a very existential fear for a lot of people.
Well, so by skipping over Godwin's law and the drawing an equivalency between Nazis and anything else for the moment, personally, I think if you have built your identity around punching Nazis, that's you can probably keep doing that forever. With that'll hold up. But I totally agree with everything else you said. My actual question, though, is not what is this guy's problem, although that was an interesting answer. My question is more like, how do I cope with this world? Like, I'm going to be me, I'm going to be doing whatever it is I'm doing based on what information I think is the best information at the moment, right? But this is no longer like a world where people are just sort of, keeping their beliefs to themselves. It's a world where they're coming up on me when I'm out. And it's like it was a daily concern for a while. It seems to have died down now that rates have spiked a little bit. I don't know if that's going to stick or not, but it's like it hasn't happened in the last couple of months, and that could be the weather. It could be that reality is setting in for more people. I'm honestly not sure, but either way, right? Like. We've avoided talking about politics a lot on this podcast, and we've avoided talking about COVID for most of this year, frankly, because it's, sad and depressing and we don't have that much information about it. I'm just like, how do you, I'm looking for coping strategies about how to deal with people who have, these little t truth beliefs that are so out there, like I used to just kind of laugh about it, with the flat earthers, and that doesn't seem like a thing I can keep doing going forward, not just because it's rude, but also just like it's not helping.
Well, so one thing I want to interject for both to present some degree of self-awareness for the podcast, and also just to go full circle with the topics that were touched on earlier, as demonstrated in the discussion we've just had. The equivalency of little t truth and big T truth is really, really hard to distinguish sometimes.
Yeah.
And what people perceive to be big T truth and or little t, there is subjectivity even in that, right? Where you could have people who are incredibly informed, who try to pursue big T truth all the time, and they confuse themselves of things that they consider to be big T truths, which are in fact not.
Well,
right?
I operate on little t truths all the time, and
right.
I'm open about that. Like what a big T truth is, like scientifically speaking, is it's something you can rederive from a reproducible experiment. And
I actually do hard classify though. Like I agree with what you're saying. Yes, all of us are human, and so we have little t truths and big T truths, but I choose to use communication as best as I can to other humans to work with big T or little t, people who prioritize the big T.
Yeah.
Now, yes, there's different
I agree with
definitions
that,
of
man.
that, but like that's my coping mechanism. Is I draw the line in the sand at as long as I'm doing as best as I can to work with people who prioritize the big T truth, then that's where I'm going to roll the dice. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's okay. I'm committed to that outcome. And
I think it's also okay to. Sorry, I think it's also okay to generally find another truth that you can agree with someone if you have there's a disagreement on something else. It's like, well, we don't agree on this, but we can at least agree on that, and we can agree that that's more productive than disagree.
So
actually, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, especially.
But in my experience, they only help as long as somebody is committed to the idea that we're both going to put in the efforts continuously to keep establishing big T truth platitudes until we can find consensus, even where we disagree, where we can agree on where we disagree rather than just agree to disagree. Because if at least for me personally, that only works as long as I'm dealing with someone who's always willing to prioritize the big T. As soon as it's well, yeah, I know that that's proven, but I don't care. It's like, then I'm done.
Well, yeah, I can't necessarily control who comes up on me in the woods, though, right? Like it's not a choice. But what I could do maybe is try to sort of, find some common ground, at least in the argument, right?
Yep. It's
like,
hey man, aren't there so many crazy conspiracy theories out there? Because you don't even have to mention any specific ones, but everybody thinks that there's some sort of conspiracy theories. Yeah. You don't have to get specific about it, and you just be on your way.
Yeah, I can get into like how to deal with those people, kind of culminating with everybody said here. It's like you got to acknowledge that person's worldview is probably, it's different than yours, right? It's not that it's wrong; it's just true to them, little T truth to them. But that worldview is built on a lot of little T truths. Like it's not just one little T truth. Like they're probably not yelling at you about lizard people because of a specific thing, right? They're yelling at you about something because of a lot of other things that they heard in the past. And though you have to engage with them and like you might not want to, and that's totally normal, right? But you have to start talking to them and find, ask them enough questions to find that commonality. They probably have a little T truth in them that they're willing to admit to you at some point in time, or you could find, right? And I think that with coronavirus, right, this COVID-19 from the last year, the only truth that I found is universal is like, this sucks, right? Like, just tell people, yeah, this sucks, right? And they're like, yeah. And now you got a common ground, and you can start building on that. And you can say like, dude, this sucks. This is all assumption on my part, but you're like, this sucks, but I wear the mask because I fucking hate, like, I just wish it would fucking end, right? And you can tell them just straight from, like, wear it because, I don't know, I don't give a shit, right? Like, it helps end it, that's fine. If you don't wear it, I don't care, but, try to get in to find that common ground, and, most people can agree that this kind of sucks. I found reasons to be happy about it, so I won't shut up about that, like the money I saved not driving everywhere and stuff. But yeah, you just try to find those common grounds with them and then work off of those, and then just stick the conversation to those points. When they go off on some wild tangent about aliens, which I've had people do, I just laugh and be like, which ones? I don't know. Like, tell me more, right? Tell me all your crazy conspiracy theories. I'm not gonna agree with them. I'm not gonna add them to my worldview. Well, I will add them to my worldview, but only in perspective to that person. Right? I'd be like, this person believes in lizard people or flat Earth. I'm like, and I acknowledge that. I don't attack them for it. I don't put them down because it doesn't harm my worldview, because I choose not to integrate their beliefs into mine. But I give them an opportunity to say theirs, and that lets them run, and get something out.
It also helps to keep your eyes on the prize, and this is for all social engagement. Like, what do you want out of this? Like, when you say, what do I do when someone walks up to me? Well, what do you want? Do you want to make that person feel safe because you perceive them as a threat? Or do you want to genuinely connect with this person? Right? Because your path of action, regardless of the big T or little t truths involved, like, should arguably, if you want to be effective, like, should be focused on what you want, because those things have very different paths.
And, a lot of this is also dependent on if you have the spoons or the energy or the, peace of mind or whatever to even want to have that conversation. Like, I've tried to have a lot of conversations on various things, and I've just kind of stopped because I've found it's not really a great use of my time. Sometimes it can be a mental drain when I try and think about, I try and like shadow box myself, I guess, with thinking like, well, what would they say to this if I said something, and it's like, you can get in a loop like that, and you can go in a spiral. And, for me, literally, it's just my day-to-day is just, I'm taking it one day at a time. I'm alive. I did good enough that day. And that's kind of like how I'm sort of trying to progress through until the day of herd immunity comes in whatever form it comes in.
Yeah, I would definitely say that there's value in just general social status of, like, among hacker type people, it's very common to say, like, always look for people smarter than you. A phrase I often use is as of late is I use the phrase relaxing into my own arrogance, right? So part of saving my spoons is also leaving social scenarios where I feel like I'm the smartest person in the room, right? Like,
Yeah, I don't use Facebook at all anymore. Like, I haven't logged into Facebook in like 4 to 5 years, probably. No. Yeah, that's about right.
It's literally once every 6 or 7 months for about 10 minutes at a time, and then I'm done. And it's basically the same thing. And that's the mentality that I base it on, which is very much like at a higher level, it's, only engage in social situations that serve you. It doesn't make you a bad person to not do so otherwise. But the way that I had to actualize it for me in a very tangible way is I had to be okay with stepping outside of my fears of being arrogant and simply say, you know what, I'm going to leave my humbleness in the corner for a moment. And each day or each period of interaction with a social group, I'm going to say, am I the smartest guy in the room? And I'm going to come to a decision based on my own big T's and little T's. And if I come to the decision that I'm the smartest guy in the room, then I'm also going to equate that this room isn't valuable for me, and I'm going to bounce, and I'm not going to feel bad about that. I have to make the conscious decision not to beat myself up about leaving or having fear about leaving data on the table. Like, no, this scenario I've decided isn't serving me anymore, I'm out, and that's okay.
Well, I am definitely not the smartest person in this room because I just learned like 3 things. So,
Round table here.
although by that rationale, like, wouldn't one person have to leave every time?
No.
every social setting is a game of musical chairs.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where I was going with that. Too.
Yeah, like someone has to decide
Get
they're the
out of my
smartest person
head,
in the
Daniel.
room, and then it's like, oh, I'm the smartest one here today. I'm out.
So one element, like, I wanted to, there were like a couple points that I wanted to like add to, you know, a lot of the topics that had been brought up. Like a lot of what Virus has been saying in this discussion, like, I have always had this mindset, phrased differently, maybe a little bit more softly. Like, I've always had the perception there's like a measurable finite output of energy that any human has for the time that they're around, right? And if you assume that there is this finite resource, and that finite resource is not money, it's time, you then end up making very calculated decisions about where and how you make that expenditure. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like that's kind of almost just a degree of awareness of your existence, right? Like you have finite time, choose what you want to do with it. And this kind of dovetails a little bit into the topics that were discussed earlier around how you frame different engagements with people. Like what you're trying to do, like I hate this analogy. It was port knocking, right? Like trying to figure out where they're going to fail open versus where they fail closed, right? Get enough information through like discovery of that individual till you can contextually understand them and put them into whatever compartmentalization or structure that you have for your life. And then decide based on that, you know, compartmentalization, what is your next action, like your own decision tree that you have in your head about how you want to maximize your time. It's like, it seems maybe callous or too like too calculating, right? But it's really not. Like you have to choose how to maximize your existence, and no one else is going to protect that interest more than you.
You know what? But that actually leads me back to fear, right? Because I have this fear that everything's going to fall apart with these ridiculous sectarian cults while I'm off writing my esoteric Go code, right? Because that's all I really wanted to do with my time.
Yeah, but
okay, and this actually brings me to another point that I didn't get to touch on earlier in the podcast, which is one of the biggest problems I find in all of the wonderful people in the hacking community that I interact with, is that especially like when those individuals are just starting out, they have no concept, no sense of the scale of the problem they want to be passionate about or invest themselves in. And they very quickly end up way too deep into the deep end of the pool, right? Like, and you're just like, whoa. You can get there eventually, but maybe understand the shape and the size of the thing you're trying to fight first. Don't just pick up the sword and shield and go charging straight in. Like,
I feel personally called out right now. But
me too. What is this here?
Right. Well, I'm speaking from the position of someone who's had scars doing that to themselves, right? Yeah, and that's almost always when you have people with that perspective, it's because they did that to themselves. Like they're like, oh yeah, there are things bigger than what my brain can handle. I should watch out for those things. I should measure things better.
I mean, I would volunteer that, like, do you think that, like, by sitting in a corner and writing esoteric Go code, the people who are spinning out, do you think they're a threat to you? And if you think they're a threat to you or a threat to the world at large, do you think there's anything you can do about it? Like, objectively, big T. Because if not, then the smartest thing you can do is stay sane. And if writing an esoteric Go code in a corner is keeping you sane, then that is pragmatically, measurably, the best thing you can do. And
well, that's good news. Because
I tend to use that as my satiating when I tend to spin out and when I tend to start sinking into my little T's and wondering based on fear if I'm doing the right thing. At the end of the day, I say, well, if I don't have any data that says that I should be doing something other than what I'm doing now, then I need to make the conscious decision that what I'm doing now is the thing I need to keep doing.
That's actually really good news, because what I've done most of this year is sit at home and write esoteric Go code, because it makes me feel better.
This podcast is quickly becoming eloquently worded descriptions of coping mechanisms for the human condition.
Oh yeah,
You need to get
That
back
was
to
a-
our disconnect.
that was our topic.
That's what that's about too.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. Because if you don't sit at home, right? I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here, right? So sorry to put you on the place. If you don't sit at home writing esoteric Go code for that being what makes you happy, right? Be whatever version of sitting at home, being happy, doing work, arguably being productive, but, engaging your mind, engaging yourself. If you don't do that and you start going out, and you might start going out to hiking trails and start yelling at people who have differing worldviews than you, right? That might have been what that guy was doing, that day when he saw you wearing a mask. Like, he might have been like out of work, not able to deal with the other issues in his life. He's not dealing with them right. And it's a little bit weird to say, jump into your work, because I've done that and it's not worked right for me in the past. It's not a great coping mechanism, but it is a coping mechanism people use, and it's a good temporary patch for a really rough spot in your life. That's what I did, but because otherwise, you're going to go out and you're going to start yelling at people who quote unquote did you wrong or have done you wrong, or you assume may have done you wrong. And that's not contributing something positive, right? You're contributing something negative to the world at that point. You might as well just go back and start contributing something positive.
The only specific empathetic example I feel like I can offer is I can just tell you specifically, Ben, like, so being a dad and being in a upper middle class environment, still being in California, it's a politically diverse environment. People come from different places. People have different beliefs. Everybody's trying to do the best for their kids. And I mean, I have a 3-year-old and a newborn on the way. I can't let him not go outside. It's not pragmatic, right? So yeah, when the parks are open, we go to the park. And when he's at the park, some of the kids have masks, some of them don't. And so I got to decide literally every second that I'm there, do I be the asshole dad? And like, I'm going to fight with my kid because he can't play with that kid because he doesn't have a mask. Or I got to talk to the parent and ask if it's okay. If they put on a mask, do they have a mask? Are they cool with that? It's a social risk every time. And I mean, as a whole separate dog leg, this is one of the superpowers of being a parent is you start very compassionately not giving fucks about the opinions of other adults because it's you and your kid. But you get, I guess a terse way to say what I'm fumbling to say is you give yourself space to make mistakes in what is the most efficient and self-serving mechanism possible, and you give yourself permission to be self-serving and say that just because I'm being self-serving doesn't mean I'm being cruel, right? And I definitely, I mean, Lay can speak up because he has kids too. I definitely feel like as a parent, you have to make peace with that part of yourself. Because you have to realize that there are going to be many situations throughout the rest of your future existence, fingers crossed, where you have to choose, your own comfort and by extension the comfort and measurable safety of your child versus the delicate feels of others. And it's a trade-off. I mean, there's not a lot of people of color where I live. I can't really afford to make enemies. Doesn't mean I'm not going to make any, right? I gotta picking your battle doesn't mean never picking.
Never picking a battle is not usually my problem, but
Fair.
oh yeah, it was well said.
Yeah, I should add that. I mean, there's a good fun side story about being a parent and learning a lot. I've even improved my infosec career by being a parent. However, it did end with my last job. The last presentation I gave at the job was very my parenting style influenced, which is kind of an idea that I'll give you enough rope, kind of like what I mentioned earlier. I'll give you enough rope to hurt yourself with, or I'll let you hurt yourself and I'll tell you what not to do, but I'll let you go ahead and continue to hurt yourself, which is a really good parenting method, right? Like, you don't want to nerf the world for your kid, right? Don't give him, like, the idea is don't give him plastic cups, give him glass cups. Because when he drops a glass cup, he drops it once, He'll know right away that was a bad thing. Drops a plastic cup, you drop plastic cup a million times. Nothing, you'll yell at your kid a million times. And the kid will have scars from being yelled at, and you'll not understand because the plastic cup never broke. And it's definitely the mentality of like, let other people get hurt, or well, let people fail. And that's kind of what you mentioned earlier, right? People 6 months ago during this pandemic issue, like they were kind of much more dicks about it kind of than they are now. And I think there's a smaller and smaller percentile just as more people get directly affected. They finally see the issue. They go, oh shit, fuck. Like now they have to take they get a big T truth in their life, right? And that big T truth comes in the form of, unfortunately, somebody they know or possibly love and care for dying or getting seriously affected. And you just wait for that big T truth to come along. And I think that's probably the best thing, is like those big T truths will objectively quash all of those little T truths in an instant. Nobody can, I mean, some people can argue that their grandma died for some other reason, but most of the time people come to that consensus that like, yeah, they can figure out what happened. They can put the pieces together. And yeah, you just let people fail. You gotta let people fail.
I'm literally sans one Defcon shot glass because I decided my 2-year-old who wanted to use glasses. Yeah. All right, here's a Defcon shot glass. Don't drop it. It'll break. If you step on the pieces, it'll hurt. He did that once.
Yep.
Never done it since.
I still have way too many conference shot glasses.
Yeah, that was my decision. We were cleaning them out, and my other half was like, we need to get rid of some of these. I was like, okay, well, 2 of them can be Luke's. And she's like, aren't they kind of significant? I was like, yeah, it's fine. If I need another one, I'll buy another one. You can't buy a new kid. I'm like, nah, he'll learn.
It's
I call
just
it
the best lesson to learn.
I call it the Jeff Foxworthy style of parenting. Nah, let him pull it on his head a few times. He'll learn.
Yeah. It works great. Yeah, I kind of alluded to it like at my last work, about a couple months before I left, I literally did a presentation, and they didn't key in that the security guy is kind of like at his wit's end during this presentation. I had a picture of a kid putting a fork in the socket and me explaining that I would not stop that. Like, I'm like, here's the workforce. You are all the kid. And here's security, is the socket and the fork. Do you see me stopping you from doing it? And I said, I'm not going to stop you from doing anything insecure. I'm going to tell you not to do it though. Right? I'm going to tell you what to do, the right way to do it, but I can't waste my energy basically like helicopter parenting every employee at this organization to make sure every time they send an email, they send it the right way, or etc. Like, I'm like, I told you how to do it right, and it's kind of up to you to not fuck it up. And like, basically said, like, when you do this, right, when you click on a phishing email or do something stupid at work, or hard code a password in the source code, or who knows, something idiotic, like, I'm going to tell you I told you not to do it, and you're going to be the one that fucks up the company. And that's kind of like my motto from all the infosec stuff, and really it's how I dealt with the last year too. You've just got to let people fuck up. It's not my job to change other people's worldviews to understand, to take a pandemic seriously. They'll figure it out eventually. And that's craziness.
Well, in terms of security, giving people the space to fuck up, realizing the value, that's part of it, right? This is, this is like a big time full circle, but this is all the way back to like, why do we do lame ass phishing exercises? Because you know what? When it goes south and you do click on it, it's better that it was from me.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And I'm not going to sit here and browbeat you and tell you're a bad person, because then that'll traumatize you and you'll focus on that. And that's not what I want. What I want you to realize is this is what it looks like when you click a bad link. Do with that information what you will.
Yeah. This time it doesn't sink the company, right? Like, and then just give them some education from there. And people fuck this up only when they start changing their security program into like some sort of like, if you don't pass the phishing test, you get some sort of dock on your pay, or you get some sort of retribution. I even wrote in my documentation. I was like, this document is like a live document. The only thing you can do wrong is not question it. You're allowed to question it, because I felt like the document is kind of just my opinion, a bunch of little T truths, right? That are kind of based on like experience. But I'm like, everything here can be argued. And I literally start the whole documentation saying everything in the security policy can be argued, and you guys should be, coming to me with questions. The only thing you can do wrong is not come to me with the question and just do the fuck all wrong thing in the first, after all. And now you've done something wrong, because, you ignored the documentation, you ignored the evidence and the recommendations. And that's kind of like, how it works out. Yeah, we're going to weigh out. We're on tangents.
And now I've learned 4 things. I might steal the little kid outlet thing for a future slide deck.
Do it. I don't own it. I love the analogy. I'm like, I will let you fuck your shit up. I don't care. I'll still be in a job, you know. I would never take like a CISO type job where I'm the one fired for somebody else fucking up. Like I will do enough due diligence to point out that I told them not to do that.
Well, should we leave it there? Oh,
Good times.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for participating in this.
Thank you all for having me.
Yes, it's amazing. Be sure to check out disconnect.camp for the future time and location of the next Disconnect camp. Also, thank you to our panel, Dan, Justin, Virus, and especially Mitchell, who, by the way, also edits all of our episodes. And we never do credits at the end.
Thank you.
He is the proverbial atlas upon which this podcast runs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think he's technically our producer. So yes, definitely thanks to Mitchell. And now more than ever, hacking is not just a crime; it's a survival.